Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've been with us on this journey through the French and Indian War, you'll know we've navigated the early British struggles, some truly catastrophic defeats, and then that slow turn towards a new strategy.
Very methodical turn.
Exactly. And today we are hitting the absolute pivotal year. We're talking about 1759, a year so packed with British victories, so decisive that it's gone down in history as the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonders.
It really is, and we're going to break down exactly why it earned that name, because the whole strategic mindset shifts here. It's no longer about just holding a fort here or there. The goal is now, well, it's the total and existential defeat of New France.
So what's our mission for this deep dive?
Our mission is to really distill the three major coordinated assaults that happened almost simultaneously and completely redefine the war. We're looking at the massive buildup for the St. Lawrence campaign, aimed right at the heart of New France, Quebec. Then we're going to shift west to the campaign that literally severed the French colonial empire in two at Fort Niagara. And finally, we'll cover the quieter but hugely significant British advance down the Lake Champlain corridor that finally secured Ticonderoga.
And that word you used, coordinated, that's the key, isn't it? This wasn't just a series of lucky breaks. This was a grand strategy, largely masterminded by William Pitt, with three prongs designed to choke New France from every direction at once.
That's it, exactly. By the end of this, you'll see how the immense planning and, frankly, the costs that went into these campaigns all served one purpose: to isolate Montcalm in Quebec and set the stage for the final act of this war.
All right, so let's start with the grand prize then. The biggest, riskiest, most ambitious part of the whole plan: the assault on Quebec. I mean, the sheer logistical scale of this is hard to even comprehend. You're moving a massive army and an entire fleet up the St. Lawrence River to attack what was essentially the fortress capital of a continent.
It was a huge gamble. This was Britain pushing all its chips to the center of the table, an all-in move.
And the command structure they put in place really reflected that high-stakes approach.
It did. For the land forces, you have General James Wolfe. A fascinating character. He was, as all the sources tell us, brilliant, intensely ambitious, but also mercurial, physically frail, often unpopular with his own men, but just absolutely relentless in his pursuit of victory.
He had a reputation for being impatient, right?
Yeah.
A man in a hurry.
Very much so. And while Wolfe, he gets the lion's share of the historical spotlight, the real operational key to this entire campaign was the Royal Navy.
The indispensable naval support, yeah.
Indispensable is the perfect word. Admiral Saunders and his fleet, you just can't overstate their importance. Getting over 200 vessels, warships, transports, the whole lot up the St. Lawrence River was probably the single greatest military and logistical achievement of the entire war.
And we should probably pause on that for a second. This isn't like sailing on the open ocean.
Oh, not at all. You have to understand, the St. Lawrence is a terrifying river for a large fleet in the 18th century. It's incredibly wide in places, but it's also fast-flowing. It's full of hidden sandbars, shoals, treacherous currents.
And the fog.
And the fog, which can roll in without any warning. The French had, for a century, basically relied on the river itself as their primary defense. They thought it was practically unbreachable by a major naval force.
Which is where you get these incredible stories of specialized skill coming to the fore. We've touched on this before, but it's so important here. There was one master navigator in particular who was out there ahead of the main fleet, meticulously charting the channel.
Yes, taking soundings, mapping the hazards in real time. And that, of course, was James Cook.
The James Cook.
The very same. Before he became the legendary explorer of the Pacific, he was a ship's master in the Royal Navy, and his skills as a surveyor and a cartographer were absolutely instrumental here. He and his team effectively turned the St. Lawrence from this unknown, terrifying maze into a navigable military highway for the British.
It's more than just sailing, then. It's science as a weapon.
It's the perfect example of it, turning scientific mapping into a direct military advantage. It guaranteed that Britain could deliver its overwhelming land force right to Quebec's front door with, minimal losses to shipwreck or accident. It just shows the level of total national mobilization Britain had achieved by this point.
So on one side, you have this massive, technologically superior force arriving on the doorstep. Let's flip to the other side. What's the situation for the French under the Marquis de Montcalm?
Well, he's facing impossible odds. He's outnumbered, he's outgunned, he has basically no naval force to counter Saunders' fleet, but he did have a very clear, let's say controversial strategy.
Okay, what was his thinking?
Montcalm was, at his core, a conventional European officer. He saw war through that very specific lens, a lens of, formal sieges, concentrated armies, and disciplined defense. So when he looked at the vast map of New France, he made what he saw as a hard but logical choice.
Which was?
That trying to defend all these distant western posts, like Fort Niagara or the forts in the Ohio Valley, it was suicidal. It was a dispersion of force that he couldn't afford.
So his belief then was that Quebec City was everything. It was the only key to Canada, as he put it.
That was his core conviction. His plan was to pull back all available forces, all his French regulars, the colonial troops de la Marine, and concentrate everything for one final climactic defense of Quebec.
But that sounds, from a logistical standpoint, wasn't that a disaster? Weren't those Western posts vital for supplying food, for trade, for maintaining alliances with the indigenous nations?
That is the absolute crux of the entire debate, and it goes right to the heart of the political infighting that was just crippling the French command.
The famous feud between Montcalm and the Governor-General, Vaudreuil.
Exactly. Vaudreuil was Canadian-born. He understood the realities of colonial warfare. He championed La Petite Guerre, the small war-using militia and indigenous allies for raids, ambushes, harassing supply lines. He saw the Western forts as the lifeblood of the colony.
And Montcalm
He
disdained it. He saw it as unprofessional, uncivilized, and ultimately ineffective against a massive, disciplined British army. For him, the only thing that mattered was an honorable defense of Quebec.
What does that even mean, an honorable defense?
It's a fascinating insight into his mindset. He held this almost philosophical belief that there were more important things in war than winning. For Montcalm, fighting to the last man in a conventional defense of Quebec would uphold the honor of the French crown, even if the colony was ultimately lost. He saw the West as already gone, and therefore irrelevant to his main purpose.
So he pulls back all his troops. Let's just clarify who we're talking about. You mentioned the troops de la Marine.
Right, so these were the French colonial regulars.
Sure.
They're distinct from the regular army regiments that Montcalm brought over from France. Their whole job for decades had been garrisoning the frontier forts, conducting diplomacy with indigenous nations, and mastering woodland fighting.
The very kind of warfare Vaudreuil was advocating for. The very same. So when Montcalm pulls them all back to Quebec, yes, he maximizes his manpower for the siege. He gets about 6,800 regulars and another 2,700 troops de la Marine. But in doing so, he guts the frontier and he ignores the unique skills of the very soldiers who were best at stopping the British before they got to Quebec.
So it's this fundamental clash of strategies. European convention versus colonial pragmatism.
And Montcalm's strategy wins out. He commits everything to fortifying the city, especially the long stretch of shoreline east of Quebec, the Beauport shore, because that's where he was absolutely convinced the main British landing would happen.
But while he's digging in, his entire strategy of concentration is being completely dismantled piece by piece, hundreds of miles away.
Precisely. Let's shift our focus westward, because at the exact same time Wolfe is deploying on the St. Lawrence, another critical campaign is unfolding, the siege of Fort Niagara.
And just remind us, why was Fort Niagara so strategically vital?
You could call Niagara the geopolitical throat of New France. It sat right on that narrow strip of land, the portage, between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. For the French, it was the irreplaceable link. It connected Canada and Montreal to the entire Great Lakes system, the Ohio Valley, and the vast, rich Illinois country.
So if you're the British, taking Niagara means you cut New France in half.
You sever it completely. You cut off all communication, all trade, all military reinforcement to every single French post in the interior of the continent. It's a killing blow to the French colonial project in the West.
The British commander there was General Prideaux, and the sources make it very clear that the success of his campaign depended less on his own redcoats and more on the cooperation of the Iroquois Confederacy.
Massively so. And this is where the diplomatic genius of Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, really comes into play. He managed to persuade the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, to finally abandon their long-held policy of neutrality and throw their full weight behind the British.
And the sources use the phrase immense commitment to describe what the Iroquois did. Let's put that into perspective.
It was a near-total mobilization of their military manpower. The Iroquois sent about 1,000 warriors to join Prideaux's army. Now, when you consider that the best estimates suggest the entire fighting strength of the Six Nations at that time was maybe 1,100 or 1,200 men.
Wow. So they're sending almost everyone.
Almost every available warrior. They were essentially leaving their own homelands and villages largely undefended. This wasn't just, picking a side in a European squabble. This was them staking their entire future existence on a British victory. It was a collective decision that the French threat had become so great and the potential rewards from a British alliance so tempting that it outweighed all the other risks.
That level of commitment must have created a very tense situation when they arrived at the siege lines,
Yeah.
especially since not all Iroquois were on the same page.
Oh, extremely tense. And the French commander at Niagara, Captain Pouchot, he was a very shrewd operator. He knew the Iroquois Confederacy was politically divided.
Right.
So during the siege, a delegation of French allied Seneca, led by a war chief named Canday, actually showed up. And Canday's mission was to approach the Iroquois, who were with Johnson, and appeal to their common heritage, to try and convince them to step aside and remain neutral. He was arguing that this was a white man's war.
So this is Johnson's nightmare. He's on a diplomatic tightrope. His entire allied force could just walk away.
Absolutely. And his response shows how well he understood Iroquois politics and expectations. He couldn't appeal to abstract loyalty to the British crown. He had to be pragmatic.
He offered them something tangible.
He did. He promised his Iroquois warriors the first chance to plunder the fort if and when it fell. This was the traditional price of military alliance, a share in the spoils of victory. It grounded their commitment in immediate material reward, not just vague promises.
But even with that promise, it was complicated. The sources say that after this diplomatic meeting, the Iroquois with Johnson mostly stopped taking an active part in the siege itself.
That's right. After about July 14th, they maintained their presence, which was hugely important. It intimidated the French garrison and prevented them from launching any major attacks on the siege lines, but they largely avoided direct combat. They were trying to minimize the risk of Iroquois fighting Iroquois.
And Pouchot, the French commander, he could see this playing out.
He could, and he was so worried that Canay's nominally pro-French warriors might switch sides or just melt away that he actually let them withdraw from the fort under a flag of truce. So the Iroquois diplomatic pressure worked on both sides of the conflict.
Okay, so the siege is dragging on. But the French aren't just sitting back. They have a major relief force marching to save Niagara.
They do. A column of about 800 men, a mix of troops de la marine, Canadian militia, and warriors from Western nations, all led by two officers named Lignery and Aubry. They were marching fast, confident they could break the British siege. The entire fate of Niagara now hinged on stopping that column.
And this leads to the decisive battle just south of the fort, the Battle of La Belle Famille on July 24th.
That's the one. The French relief force was likely underestimating the British, who had set up a very well-prepared ambush to intercept them.
And the British commander, Colonel Massey, deployed his men with just devastating precision. Let's break down the tactical genius here.
It's a textbook example of discipline versus momentum. The French column was advancing in a very wide formation, about 12 men across, good for moving quickly through the woods, but not for a stand-up fight.
Right.
Massey, who was actually wounded but still giving orders, commanded his British regulars to do something incredibly difficult: hold their fire. They just stood there and let the French column advance and advance until it was only 30 yards away.
30 yards? That is terrifyingly close range for 18th century combat.
It's point blank. At that distance, the inaccuracy of the smoothbore musket doesn't matter. It becomes a massive shotgun. And the sources say the first volley, 7 volleys in quick succession, actually from about 140 muskets, was just devastating.
I wasn't all, was it?
No. That initial blast was immediately followed by a murderous crossfire on the French left flank from a company of British grenadiers that Massey had positioned perfectly. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for the French.
The column just disintegrated.
It broke completely. The survivors veered to their right trying to escape and ran straight into another prepared British position. It was a total disaster. The French suffered around 340 men killed or captured. That includes both of their commanders.
And the British casualties.
Almost negligible, only 12 killed and 40 wounded. The asymmetry just tells you everything you need to know about the tactical execution. It was a surgical, annihilating victory based on superior discipline and the nerve to wait for that critical 30-yard moment.
And what happened right after the battle speaks to that deal Johnson made with the Iroquois.
It does, in a very stark way. The British and American provincial troops immediately had to form a protective screen around the captured French officers, saving them from the Iroquois warriors who had been watching the battle.
The spectators.
Exactly. And the moment the French line broke, the Iroquois warriors surged forward to pursue the fleeing soldiers, taking the prisoners and scalps that Johnson had promised them. It was the brutal fulfillment of their side of the bargain.
So with that relief column completely destroyed, Captain Pouchot in Fort Niagara had no options left.
None whatsoever. He surrendered the fort on July 26th. And just like that, the western anchor of New France was gone. The entire interior of the continent was now cut off from Quebec. Montcalm's gamble on concentrating his forces was already failing, spectacularly.
Okay, so that's the western prong of the attack. At the same time, another British army is moving on the northern front.
That's right. While Niagara was falling, General Jeffrey Amherst, the victor of Louisbourg the previous year, was leading that third coordinated assault, moving north from Albany, down the Lake Champlain corridor, with Montreal as his eventual target.
And we really need to see this campaign in contrast to what we talked about back in our sixth deep dive.
Yes, the 1758 campaign.
The devastating British failure at Ticonderoga, or Fort Carillon, as the French called it, under General Abercrombie. He had a massive army, 16,000 men, and was completely routed by a much smaller French force.
Amherst's entire approach in 1759 seems to have been defined by one goal. Do not repeat the disaster of 1758. He was cautious to a fault. His personal motto could have been security to speed.
He wasn't in a rush.
Not at all. People in London were screaming for him to hurry up and support Wolfe at Quebec, but Amherst was deliberate, methodical. He was all about logistics. Before he even put a man on a boat, he was rebuilding the entire infrastructure of his advance.
What did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, it was a massive engineering project. He spent weeks improving the road from Fort Edward to the lake so he could haul the thousands of tons of cannon, ammunition, and supplies needed for a proper siege. He spent a whole month just assembling all his material and building an entirely new fort, Fort George, to replace the old Fort William Henry. He was making his base absolutely impregnable before moving forward.
So finally, on July 21st, he gets his army of 10,000 men, a mix of regulars and provincials, onto the boats and heads for Ticonderoga, presumably prepared for a long, difficult siege.
He was. But here again, Montcalm's grand strategy completely changes the equation. The French commander in the north, an officer named Bourlamaque, was operating under very strict orders from Montcalm.
And those orders were?
Your job is not to die holding isolated forts. Your job is to preserve your army so you can fall back and help defend the heartland. Bourlamaque saw Amherst's massive, slow-moving army coming and knew it was inevitable. He wasn't going to sacrifice his irreplaceable men defending a fort that Montcalm now considered strategically irrelevant.
So he didn't even fight?
He executed a scorched earth withdrawal. As Amherst's fleet approached, Bourlamaque's men lit the fuses to the fort's powder magazine, blew a huge hole in Fort Carillon, and retreated north. They did the same thing a few days later at the next fort, Crown Point.
So Amherst just walks in and takes possession of these smoking ruins?
Essentially, yes. It's a massive, bloodless strategic victory. He achieves what 16,000 men failed to do the year before, simply because French priorities had shifted so dramatically. He now controlled the entire Lake George and Lake Champlain corridor.
Which was the historic invasion route between New York and Canada.
Exactly. Amherst immediately sets his men to work rebuilding Ticonderoga and constructing an even larger fortress at Crown Point, cementing British control over that entire northern approach. So by the end of the summer, the strategic picture is crystal clear.
Right, let's recap. If you remember from our last deep dive, the British took Fort Duquesne in 1758, giving them control of the Ohio Valley. Now, in the summer of '59, the West is completely severed with the fall of Niagara, and the northern corridor is wide open to the capture of Ticonderoga and Crown Point. The noose is getting incredibly tight.
All three prongs of the British plan have delivered. Quebec is now, for all practical purposes, completely isolated. Which brings us back to Wolfe, waiting impatiently on the banks of the St. Lawrence.
Okay, so let's return to Quebec. By this point, the siege has been going on since late June, and Wolfe is finding that Montcalm's defenses along that Beauport shore are just unbreakable.
They were virtually impregnable to a frontal assault, and the psychological and physical toll this stalemate was taking on Wolfe was immense.
The sources paint a really grim picture of his health by August.
They do. His health was failing badly. By August 19th, one of his aides wrote that the general could not rise from his bed. Wolfe himself wrote that he felt ruined by the stress and the constant frustration. You can just imagine the pressure. He has this gigantic army, he has total naval superiority, and yet he's completely stalemated.
And morale among the troops must have been plummeting.
It was. Rumors of a total British retreat before winter were starting to circulate. Wolfe was getting desperate. He had to force a battle.
And this desperation leads him to shift tactics, doesn't it? He issues orders to begin a campaign of devastation.
Yes. In late August, he outlines these new tactical options, and they all include the injunction to ruin and destroy the Canadian countryside, burning farms, destroying villages. It was a shift to psychological warfare. If he couldn't beat Montcalm's army, he would try to break the will of the civilian population and force Montcalm out of his fortifications to stop the destruction.
But before he gets to that point, he tries one last huge conventional assault, the Battle of Beauport on July 31st.
Or the Battle of Montmorency, as it's also known. Yes, this was his first and only major attempt to break the Beauport lines by force, and it ended in absolute disaster for the British.
Break down for us why it fails so spectacularly.
Well, it was really a combination of Montcalm having the perfect defensive position and, frankly, poor British planning and timing. Wolfe's plan involved a two-pronged assault on some French redoubts near the base of the Montmorency Falls. The idea was that troops who had crossed the river further upstream would link up with a landing force coming ashore from the fleet. But the timing was critical. And the tide betrayed them. The grenadiers, the elite shock troops who were leading the amphibious assault, they were too eager. They rushed their attack, scrambling ashore and charging forward before the other forces were in position to support them.
A fatal mistake.
A catastrophic one. Because to get to the French positions, they had to cross these wide, tidal flats, soft mud, slippery rocks, all while under a blistering fire from Montcalm's men, who were safely entrenched on the high ground above them. It was a slaughter.
So the grenadiers were just cut to pieces. Devastating losses, the sources say.
Completely repulsed with very heavy casualties. It was a clear, absolute tactical victory for Montcalm. And up to that point, it proved his entire strategy correct. He had concentrated his forces, he had predicted where the main attack would come, and he had held his ground.
He must have felt completely vindicated.
You'd have to think so. And he was so certain that the Beauport shore was the only place Wolfe would dare to attack that he started dismissing any British activity elsewhere as a mere distraction.
Like the British ships that were starting to appear upriver past the city.
Exactly. Admiral Saunders was deliberately sailing a few ships past Quebec's guns at night, making a lot of noise, sending boats out to take soundings. It was a brilliant naval feint designed to draw Montcalm's attention. But Montcalm took the bait. He saw it as just a distraction and refused to significantly weaken his main defensive line on the Beauport shore to counter it.
But this failure at Beauport, it ends up being the crucial turning point for Wolfe, doesn't it? It forces him to realize he can't win this way.
It does. The famously arrogant, headstrong General Wolfe is finally forced to listen to his subordinates, his 3 brigadiers.
And after the disaster at Montmorency, they come to him with a new plan.
A joint recommendation, yes. His brigadiers Townsend, Monckton, and Murray, they collectively recognized that trying to assault the Beauport lines again was suicide. The only way to win was to force Montcalm out of his trenches and make him fight a European-style battle on open ground.
And their plan to do that involved using the one huge advantage the British had.
The Navy. Since Saunders had proven he could get ships past the city, they argued for a major landing far upstream, to the west of Quebec. The idea was to land there, cut Montcalm's supply lines from Montreal, and threaten the city from its much weaker, undefended western side.
Wolfe had resisted this idea before, hadn't he?
He had. He was worried that a landing so far upriver would isolate his army from the main fleet and leave them vulnerable. But now, having failed everywhere else, the brigadier's plan was really the only viable option left on the table.
So the entire British strategy shifts.
It shifts completely. The goal is no longer to assault the fortifications. The goal is now to isolate the city and force Montcalm to come out and fight on ground of Britain's choosing. And that strategic pivot, born from the desperation of the failure at Beauport, is what sets up the most famous battle in North American history.
A perfect place to leave it for now. So as we wrap up this deep dive on the opening campaigns of 1759, the Annus Mirabilis, the strategic situation is just night and day compared to a year earlier.
Completely transformed. By the end of the summer, the British have achieved almost all of their major objectives. The western lifeline of NewFrance is gone with the fall of Fort Niagara.
The northern invasion corridor is secured with the bloodless capture of Ticonderoga and Crown Point.
And as you mentioned, this is all built on the success of the previous year with the capture of Fort Duquesne, which locked down the Ohio River Valley.
The operational noose, as you called it, is pulled tight.
It is. Montcalm, having staked everything on his honorable, concentrated defense of Quebec, is now totally isolated. He successfully beat back Wolfe's first major assault at Beauport, yes, but he had to concede almost the entire rest of the continent to do it.
And this really brings us back to that core philosophy of, as you mentioned earlier, that there were more important things in war than winning.
It does. He believed in the honor of a conventional fight. So now, with Wolfe about to use naval power to land upstream and force him onto open ground on the Plains of Abraham, Montcalm is faced with a choice that will define his legacy.
Does he stick to his defensive strategy, wait inside his walls for reinforcements, and use his Canadian militia for the kind of irregular warfare he despised?
Or does he rush out to meet the enemy on their terms, driven by his European officer's code of honor, and risk everything in one decisive battle?
A stunning moment where a commander's personal philosophy and sense of duty are about to determine the fate of an empire.
It's the ultimate tension, and that decision, as we'll see, sealed the fate of New France.
We will break down that very decision and the legendary battle that followed in our next deep dive. Join us then as we cover the dramatic climax of 1759, the secret landing, the battle on the Plains of Abraham, and the final fall of Quebec.